you're not one thing. You're a dynamic system of interrelating parts. You are a living thing made of living things.
And that is the archetype.
Welcome to Voicecraft, a platform and context for transformative philosophy, cultivating culture, and the craft of voice. This is an in-depth introduction to archetypes, with a little help from Carl Jung himself, captured in episode 45 of the podcast titled The Alchemy of Age Shifting with the neo-Jungian Anderson Todd. Subscribe to the channel for transformative dialogues and short clips across themes of psyche, culture and nature, and how we might increase our capacity for conscious, adaptive response to our world in transition.
Archetypes within Jung are, in a sense, the sort of organizing structures of the psyche. Okay, so if you think about, Freud's model of the psyche, which everybody knows, we have the superego and the ego and the id, right? And in many ways, right, this is a kind of hydraulic structure where the superego, right, your inner nag, is operating on one side, and the id is attempting to drag you from the other side, and you're caught in this kind of tug of war between them, where the ego is dragged back and forth. It's kind of hydraulic system with a few parts, and it elaborates a bit over time. Jung's model, on the other hand, is very multipolar, or you could think of it as being a bit polytheistic. So there are sort of multiple centers within the psyche that are operating. And importantly, and this was part of where his big breakup from Freud happened, it's not all just sort of entrained to and dominated by the erotic drive. So it's not just all about sex or later sex and death, sort of late stage Freud, but rather there are a bunch of sort of centers within the psyche that are structures that organize the way that people's minds work. And above and beyond their sort of particular and individual constitution of their psyche, they also organize the collective unconscious, which is also a huge stumbling block for people.
I had written that book that cost me my friendship with Freud because he couldn't accept it. Yes. To him, the unconscious was a product of consciousness, yes. And it simply contained the remnants. I mean, it was sort of storeroom where all the discarded things of consciousness were heaped up and left. But to me, the unconscious then was already a matrix, a sort of basis of consciousness of a creative nature, namely capable of autonomous acts. Autonomous intrusions into consciousness. So
part of the problem, one of the problems that I often speak on is that he's writing his work and his theory over the span of, 50 years. So from sort of the teens through to his death in the early 60s, he has this volume of writings, and necessarily his ideas about these things shift over that period, right? He tends to favor a kind of completeness over consistency, and so he gets these shifts. And so depending on where you come in to the timeline on the idea of archetype, you're going to get a very different sort of explanation or version of the archetype. Now, he is quite insistent that none of these descriptions, lists, or maps are sort of the thing in itself, right? That's important. So the map isn't the territory. We can talk about this stuff, but at the end of the day, it's a set of handles that we're using to understand something that in some fundamental sense is going to exceed whatever our description of the model are. So you can't just come up with this neat list of archetypes, right? Shadow, ego, persona, right? That stuff is handy, but ultimately speaking, it's something of a shorthand for what's really going on.
The archetype is a force, it has an autonomy. It can suddenly seize you. It is like a seizure.
Yes.
So, for instance, falling in love at first sight, that is such a case. You see, you have a certain image in yourself without knowing it of the woman, of the woman.
Yes.
Now you see that girl, or at least a good imitation of your type. And instantly you get a seizure and you're gone. And afterwards you may discover that it was a hell of a mistake. you see, a man is quite capable, he's intelligent enough to see that that woman of his choice, as one says, not no choice, he has been captured.
Yeah.
And that is the archetype. That is the so-called archetype of the anima.
Yes. Yes.
He thinks it is all his soul, you know. Like the girls, you know, when a man sings very high, then he thinks he must have a very wonderful spiritual character because he can sing the high C.
Yeah.
And she's badly disappointed when she marries that particular number.
Yeah. Well,
that is the archetype of the animus.
But what is the archetype, if I say an organizing principle? So we're used to thinking about archetypes, I think, when we encounter them casually in pop culture as being sort of the core set of iconic figures that you might see in a myth or in a fairy tale. So, you know, the king, the dragon, the warrior, right? You know, the damsel in distress. To some extent, that's a way to think about them when we're thinking about the collective unconscious. But I think an easier way to get at these is just to consider the kinds of shared psychic structures that all of us invariably have. So to give you an example, necessarily, because of biology, everybody alive on Earth has a mother, right? Automatically, it's a given, right? They may not know their mother, but the point is, right, they are going to have a relationship with the mother. They will have gestated inside of somebody. As such, right, and mammals being what they are, and humans in particular, we have a really long developmental period, right? We have this bonding thing. And so there is a natural kind of relationship that is formed with a mother or a caretaker. It can be a substitute caretaker. But the point is, right, in sort of most evolved standard conditions, there's going to be this bonding event that occurs between a child and a mother that is going to be pivotal to the child's sort of success and survival. So evolution, in a sense, if you want to think about this naturalistically, preloads the sort of infant version a little bit in order to facilitate this. So an example that I like to use here is geese. So geese, when they hatch out of an egg, go through a short phase called imprinting. So what happens is, you know, the egg cracks open and the little gosling fixes its eyes on whatever is nearby and it imprints on it as the mother. Now, 99% of the time, of course, that's going to be an adult goose that is looking after the eggs. And so the gosling imprints on the goose, and then it behaves towards the goose in the ways that are adaptive for it. So if the goose walks someplace, right, the goslings will all toddle along after it in a little line. And these are the behaviors that we're used to seeing in nature. But if you intervene experimentally, which I wouldn't want to do because it sounds cruel, but it was done before we invented ethics in 1995, you can get a gosling to imprint on a surprisingly wide range of persons and objects. You can get them to imprint on you, the experimenter. You can get them to imprint on a stuffed animal. You can get them to imprint on a ping pong ball if you present it in the right way, in the right time at the window. And if you do that, you know, you take a ping pong ball, you imprint the goslings, and then you roll that ping pong ball along the table, the goslings will all toddle after it, right? So they have a set of behaviors towards the world, right, which is sort of, in some sense, kind of pre-built in to them. And they have a kind of time-sensitive, you know, hole in their psyche, which is ready to receive material and then behave towards that material in a certain way. If you want to think about this in Jungian terms, there's sort of three phases to an archetype. So the archetype stands outside your knowledge completely, right? It's the Kantian thing in itself. So you can't ever get at the archetype. It's sort of necessarily invisible to you. You can only sense it by its effects. So what you get is some layers. You get the archetype, which you have to sort of infer the existence of, whatever. You get the archetypal image, which is typically the cultural material, which builds up in general around this whole. And then you have people's particular material, which we would call their complex. So everybody has complexes, right? We talk about somebody having an Oedipus complex or a superiority complex, right? And complex is the material that people have specifically sort of in that archetypal gap. So you can think about it, and it's like most goslings are going to have a complex, which is their mother, their specific mother. And you know, most animals tend to have variations in their personality. So the specifics of what they end up with in their complex is going to be dependent on who they imprint on, right? Who the mother is. But if they end up imprinting on a ping pong ball, then the material that they have is going to be problematic for them, probably in some way or another, right? It's going to cause them issues because the information that they're then taking through this sort of this primed system ready to receive information about the world is going to be sort of mucked up with a slightly inappropriate set of contents or a problematic set of contents. Humans have this stuff too. So we can think about, yes, we have sort of, slots where mother and father go, or, primary caregivers. We have the slots where our early romantic interests start to slot in, right? So it's not uncommon to talk to people clinically and personally, where they will tell you that, their romantic interests have heavily patterned after somebody they had a crush on when they were 11. And then we also develop both sort of culturally relevant, but also family culture and personally relevant images around all of the other things that are, human universals. Every human culture has a concept of war, right? A concept of war. And so the warrior is sort of a universal type among humans. There are no human groups on Earth that don't have some idea of, the wise woman or the wise man, right? Somebody who has sort of special knowledge in some sense. Humans universally have certain kinds of, sort of spiritual ideas, right? So far as I know, it's a cultural universal that up is associated with good and down is associated with bad. And you find that everywhere. And you can sort of think about this and think there are all sorts of reasons why those associations in play, and they're genetic and they're functional, and right? Some of them are an outgrowth of culture, but the point is that these patterns in our thinking are sort of universal and to some extent programmed in. You can also look at, for instance, cases where human infants have responses to certain kinds of patterns. There has been a bunch of experimental work that shows that infants will show a fear response to the patterns of a spider or a snake, even if they have never encountered a spider or a snake. So on one level, if provided that sort of finding holds up, you can say, well, that makes sense, right? Evolution probably predisposed babies not to reach for spiders, right? When we were, coming up during the evolutionary sort of arc. But above and beyond that, what it means is that you can imagine how that filters down. What it means then in turn is that that's going to pick up all this additional cultural material. If you have something that is a fearful concept and a human universal, you're going to get all kinds of additional symbolism and stuff building up from it, right? So that's kind of the gist of it. There are some other archetypes within the system, but I suppose the shorthand way to think about it is this. And this is sort of, I think, the central insight of most of the psychodynamic systems from Freud onwards. You're not one thing. You're a dynamic system of interrelating parts. And those parts are not, I'm sort of contra Freud, those parts are not mechanical subsystems. They're not hydraulic. You are a living thing made of living things, right? Which should sort of be obvious, right? We're made of living cells and living tissues. We have bacteria in us, we've got skin mites on us, right? But the same thing applies to, if you want to get purely naturalistic, our brain. Our brain is a living thing made out of individual living things, which exist in a competitive structure for resources. And the fact is that, yes, we have this consciousness that we associate with sort of our whole body and whole brain that we call Anderson or Tim, right? But then the individual subsystems don't suddenly stop having any measure of agency, consciousness, or any of the other things just because they're slightly smaller. In fact, what you have instead is a whole bunch of these systems interacting together in a communal fashion to produce the psychic thing that you typically apply the high label to, that is you. So you have a bunch of these parts in your psyche, and they sort of all answer to the same name and live at the same address, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're all communicating with each other. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they all see things the same way or have the same goals.
Oh, well, I just paid a visit to him in Vienna, and then we talked for 13 hours without interruption.
13 hours
For
without
13
interruption.
hours without interruption. We didn't realize that we were almost dead at the end of it, but it was tremendously interesting.
Thank you for watching. If you value this work and want to see more of it, please support Voicecraft media creation at patreon.com/voicecraft.